something about this story doesn't make sense. There exists, buried in the municipal archives of Tulsa, Oklahoma, a set of documents that were sealed for decades. Records of a commission that convened too late. Photographs that disappeared from newspaper offices. Death certificates that were never issued. Graves that, according to official records, do not exist. And yet, when researchers began quietly running ground-penetrating radar across a Tulsa cemetery in 2020, they found them. Dozens of them. Arranged in rows. The story of what happened in Tulsa over 36 hours in late May and early June of 1921 is not a secret exactly. It is something stranger than a secret. It is a story that was known, and then quietly set aside. Discussed in whispers for half a century, then formally suppressed, then gradually, incompletely recovered. A story in which the most prosperous black community in American history was reduced to ash in less than 2 days, and then almost immediately, the machinery of forgetting began to turn. To understand what happened in Tulsa, you have to first understand what Tulsa was. In the years following the Civil War, thousands of African Americans made their way to the Oklahoma Territory, drawn by the promise of land and the relative distance from the brutality of the Deep South. They settled, they farmed, they built churches and schools. By the time Oklahoma achieved statehood in 1907, black communities had established themselves across the region. But it was in Tulsa, and more specifically in a neighborhood called Greenwood, where something remarkable occurred. Greenwood was built on commerce. In the first 2 decades of the 20th century, African American entrepreneurs established banks, law offices, hotels, grocery stores, theaters, and medical clinics. The neighborhood supported 2 black newspapers, 2 black schools, and a library. There were beauty salons and law firms, and a hospital. The district stretched roughly 35 blocks, concentrated north of the Frisco Railroad tracks that divided Tulsa's black and white populations. By 1921, the Greenwood district was home to an estimated 10,000 people and contained somewhere between 300 and 600 black-owned businesses, depending on the source consulted, a discrepancy that itself hints at the imprecision with which these records were kept. It was Booker T. Washington who, upon visiting, coined the phrase that would echo through history. He called Greenwood the Black Wall Street of America. The name stuck. It was, by almost any measure, an extraordinary place. And that extraordinary quality, that concentration of black wealth and self-sufficiency at a time when the Ku Klux Klan had revived and was spreading rapidly through Oklahoma, may have made it a target. The social conditions of Tulsa in 1921 require careful attention. The Klan was not a fringe organization in this period. It had an estimated chapter in Tulsa, and its members were widely understood to include police officers, city officials, and prominent businessmen. The post-World War I years had produced what historians call the Red Summer of 1919, a period of widespread anti-black violence across the United States, in Chicago, in Washington, in Elaine, Arkansas, in dozens of other cities. The threat of violence was not paranoia. It was a lived reality. And then, on the afternoon of May 30, 1921, a young black man named Dick Rowland stepped into an elevator. Dick Rowland was 19 years old. He shined shoes at a stand in downtown Tulsa, and on that Monday afternoon, he entered the elevator of the Drexel Building to use one of the few restrooms in the area designated for black Tulsa residents. The elevator was operated by a 17-year-old white woman named Sarah Page. What happened inside that elevator in the seconds that followed has never been established with certainty. What is known is this: someone in the building heard a noise and looked up to see Sarah Page and Dick Rowland. Page may have stumbled. Rowland may have reached out to catch her. Or they may have known each other. Some accounts suggest they did, and the contact between them was ordinary. Whatever occurred, Rowland ran. And within hours, the story had been transformed. The following morning, May 31st, the Tulsa Tribune published an article beneath the headline, "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in Elevator." The article itself has a peculiar history. The original copy has vanished. It no longer exists in the Tribune's archives. It is absent from the microfilm held at the Tulsa City County Library. The only record of its precise wording comes from people who say they saw it, and from the fact that what followed was one of the deadliest episodes of racial violence in American history. By the afternoon of May 31st, a crowd of white Tulsa residents had gathered outside the courthouse where Rowland was being held. The Tulsa Police Department later claimed they were preparing to protect him. But the crowd swelled. Rumors spread. Someone in the crowd claimed that Rowland was about to be lynched, and a group of black Tulsans, many of them veterans of World War I, men who had served their country and returned to find that country unchanged, went to the courthouse to offer their assistance in protecting Rowland. Shots were fired. By whom first, no investigation has definitively established. And then the darkness came. What followed those first gunshots has been reconstructed through a mosaic of evidence: eyewitness testimonies collected decades later, the records of insurance claims that were filed and denied, newspaper accounts from the days after, a commission report that was commissioned in 1997 and completed in 2001, and the patient, methodical work of historians who spent years retrieving a story that had been deliberately buried. By dawn on June 1, 1921, the Greenwood district was being attacked by a mob estimated in various accounts at anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 white residents. What is documented is the scale of the destruction. More than 35 blocks of Greenwood were burned to the ground. At least 1,256 homes were destroyed. The black hospital was burned. The black schools were burned. Churches, law offices, beauty parlors, the offices of the black newspapers, the hotels and the grocery stores, reduced to ash and rubble. The 2001 Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa race riot estimated that between 100 and 300 people were killed, though the commission acknowledged that the true number may never be known. Other researchers have placed the death toll higher. What makes this figure so difficult to pin down is itself one of the most disturbing elements of the story. Death certificates were not issued for many of the victims. Bodies were reported to have been buried in mass graves. The city's records from this period are, in certain places, conspicuously incomplete. There is a particular detail about those 36 hours that investigators have returned to repeatedly. Multiple eyewitness accounts, collected by researcher and historian Scott Ellsworth in his landmark 1982 study, Death in a Promised Land, and later corroborated by additional testimony gathered for the 2001 Commission, describe something that official accounts long denied: airplanes. Witnesses described seeing small aircraft flying low over the Greenwood district during the attack. Some described them as surveillance planes. Others described seeing objects drop from them. The official position, held for decades, was that this simply did not happen. Then, in 2020 and 2021, researchers examining the historical record found references in contemporary police and National Guard documents suggesting that airplanes had indeed been deployed. The aircraft belonged, some accounts suggest, to a private airfield operated by individuals connected to the Tulsa Police Department. What they were doing over Greenwood, whether observing, communicating positions to the mob below, or something more, has not been resolved. The airplanes are one of the hinges on which this story quietly swings. What makes the Tulsa massacre difficult to categorize as a spontaneous riot, which is how it was characterized for most of the 20th century, is the pattern of official involvement that emerges from the evidence. Tulsa police officers did not only fail to intervene. Multiple accounts, including those documented in the 2001 Commission report, describe police officers participating in the attack on Greenwood. Some witnesses testified that officers led groups of white civilians into black-owned homes and businesses. The Tulsa County Sheriff's Office deputized members of the attacking mob, handing weapons to civilians and offering them legal sanction to act. National Guard troops, when they arrived, focused much of their energy on arresting black Tulsans rather than protecting them. Approximately 6,000 black residents of Tulsa were detained. They were held in improvised internment camps, at the convention hall at the fairgrounds, while their neighborhood burned. Many were required to obtain a card signed by a white employer before they could be released. It was, researchers have noted, a system that replicated certain features of the vagrancy laws and debt peonage arrangements that had characterized black life in the South since Reconstruction. Even in displacement, the familiar structures of control reasserted themselves. The insurance dimension of this story has received less attention than it deserves. Black Tulsans who had lost homes and businesses filed insurance claims after the massacre. The insurance companies denied virtually all of them, citing riot exclusion clauses. City officials, rather than offering compensation, discussed ordinances that would have prevented the rebuilding of Greenwood. Ordinances that, historians have noted, would have effectively transferred ownership of the land to white developers at a fraction of its value. The ordinances ultimately failed, and Greenwood was rebuilt, though never to its former scale. But the attempt to use the catastrophe as an opportunity for land seizure is part of the pattern that investigators have traced with growing clarity. None of this happened by accident. Catastrophes of this scale and coordination do not emerge spontaneously. Something organized the violence of those 36 hours. And the question of what exactly was organized, by whom, and with whose knowledge and approval, has never been fully answered. For 50 years, the massacre was not discussed in Tulsa's public schools. It was not mentioned in the city's official histories. The local newspapers, which had covered the immediate aftermath, fell silent on the subject. The Tribune, whose front page had helped ignite the violence, never published a substantial accounting of what it had set in motion. And in the absence of public memory, the survivors carried the story privately, in family kitchens, in church basements, in conversations that were not recorded, that did not become part of the archive. Olivia Hooker was 6 years old when the mob came to her family's home. She survived and went on to live to the age of 103, dying in 2018, and in her final decades, she became one of the most important voices in the reconstruction of Greenwood's history. She described, in interviews collected by researchers and journalists in her later years, the sound of her mother's china being smashed on the kitchen floor by men who came in through the back door. She described the way her father stood in the front room, very still, while the house was ransacked. She described the smell of smoke from the direction of the neighborhood's main commercial street. Survivors like Hooker were not the exception. They were, for decades, the primary archive. The official records had been curated, and in some cases the curation was not subtle. The original Tulsa Tribune article that triggered the massacre, a document that historians would very much like to read, is simply gone. The relevant microfilm reel in the library collection has been removed. When researchers identified this absence and investigated, they found that no explanation for the removal had been recorded. There is also the matter of what happened to Dick Rowland. He was never charged. Sarah Page declined to press charges, and the case against him was dismissed. He left Tulsa shortly after his release and is believed to have moved to Kansas City or possibly farther west. His subsequent history is unknown. He became, in the official record, a small footnote at the beginning of a catastrophe he did not cause, and then he disappeared. Records from the Red Cross, which operated relief efforts in the aftermath of the massacre, provide some of the most granular evidence of the destruction scale. The Red Cross surveyed the damage and documented the number of displaced persons. Their estimates of destroyed property were significantly higher than those of city officials, a discrepancy that speaks either to differing methodologies or to a deliberate minimization of the catastrophe in official city records. A collection of photographs taken in the immediate aftermath of the burning also has a troubled history. Photographs circulated in Tulsa's white newspapers in the days after the massacre, depicting the ruins of Greenwood. Some photographers documented the destruction in considerable detail. In subsequent decades, collections of these photographs passed through private hands, some making their way into historical archives, others disappearing. Certain images that are known to have existed, because they were referenced in written accounts, have never been located. The 2001 Oklahoma Commission report was a serious piece of work. It was produced by scholars and researchers who examined available evidence carefully and honestly. And even this commission, with the resources of the state behind it, arrived at conclusions that were in certain places deliberately hedged, constrained by what the evidence could and could not prove. The commission recommended reparations. The state legislature declined to act on those recommendations in any substantive way. And so we are left with a set of questions that the official record cannot resolve. Who, precisely, organized the attack on Greenwood? Were the airplanes deployed by individuals acting independently, or did they operate with official sanction? What happened to the bodies of the people who died in those 36 hours, the people for whom no death certificates were issued, who do not appear in any official count? Where are the mass graves that witnesses described and that ground-penetrating radar has begun to locate? Why was that newspaper microfilm removed? What did Sarah Page tell investigators, in full, and why does the record of that conversation not exist? Who made the decision to deputize civilians in the middle of an attack on a residential neighborhood? Who authorized the aircraft? Who gave the order, or gave the tacit permission, for the internment of thousands of Tulsa's black residents while their homes were being destroyed? These are not rhetorical questions. They are questions to which specific answers once existed, in documents, in communications, in decisions made by identifiable people. Some of those documents were preserved. Others were not. The gap between what was preserved and what was not is itself a form of evidence, though evidence of a kind that is difficult to present in a court or a classroom. The 2020 excavations at Oaklawn Cemetery, prompted by the combination of eyewitness testimony and modern ground-penetrating radar, identified anomalies consistent with mass burials. The work is ongoing. The city of Tulsa and a team of forensic anthropologists continue to examine the site. Each discovery reopens the question of how many people died, and opens a further question. Why were they buried without names, without records, without any official acknowledgement that they existed? The answer to that last question may be the most important thing the Tulsa Massacre tells us, not merely about what happened in one city in 1921, but about the mechanisms by which catastrophic events are processed, minimized, and eventually made to seem as though they belong to a distant and separate world. In 1921, a city burned. In the years that followed, the people who burned it returned to their homes and their businesses and their civic offices. The people whose homes and businesses had been destroyed rebuilt what they could, on land whose ownership was suddenly uncertain, in a city whose institutions had just demonstrated, with terrible clarity, that they were not neutral. Greenwood was rebuilt. It survived, in reduced form, through the middle of the 20th century. Urban renewal projects in the 1960s, a phenomenon that devastated black commercial districts across America, did what the fire of 1921 had not quite managed to do completely. The Greenwood district today is a fraction of what it was. The story came back slowly in pieces, through the work of survivors who refused to be entirely silent, through researchers who noticed the gaps in the archive and began to trace their outlines, through a 1996 state commission that took 5 years to produce its report, through journalists and documentary filmmakers and the relatives of people who had lived through those 36 hours and never forgotten them. The ground-penetrating radar found what the official record said was not there. Perhaps what happened in Tulsa was, as it was characterized for so long, an episode of spontaneous mob violence, terrible but comprehensible within the brutal racial logic of its era. Perhaps the absence of death certificates was administrative failure. Perhaps the missing microfilm was misplaced in a move, decades ago, and its disappearance means nothing. Perhaps the airplanes were merely curious observers, and the deputies sworn in during the attack were a well-intentioned mistake by overwhelmed officials. Perhaps all the threads, pulled individually, simply fray. Or perhaps what the survivors of Greenwood understood, what Olivia Hooker understood when she was 6 years old and heard her mother's china breaking, was something that the official record was constructed precisely to prevent us from seeing clearly. They built something extraordinary. And something was done to it. And then a very deliberate effort was made to ensure that what was done would not be fully known. The bodies are still in the ground. The work of naming them has only just begun. And the question that haunts every archive, every gap in the microfilm, every denial stamped on every insurance claim, is the simplest one. If there was nothing to hide, why was so much hidden?